What's going on, my fellow rock and rollers? Now, when people think of Seattle, they mostly think of the big four grunge bands, including Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden. But of course, there was a lot of bands to emerge out of the Pacific Northwest whose story never got as much coverage as the big four. And some of that was due to the fact that their music really never caught on because tragedy would strike before they could break big, and the Gits were one of those bands. Now, the Gits came out of Seattle in the early 90s, and they were known for their brand of fiery punk rock. They made a name for themselves with their extensive tours across the West Coast and with an indie debut record. Now, it seemed like the rest of the decade was going to be a promising one because as time went on, the band got more national exposure and even got the attention of major record labels. But tragedy would strike in 1993 when the band made headlines across the US, but it wasn't the type of attention the band had hoped for. Early in the morning of July 7, 1993, singer Mia Zapata's body was found on a deserted street in Seattle. Born on August 25, 1965, Mia Catherine Zapata grew up in the upper middle-class suburb of Louisville, Kentucky. Both her parents were media executives, and Zapata would attend Ohio's Antioch College in 1984 as a liberal arts student, where she would meet bassist Matt Dresner, guitarist Andy Kessler, and drummer Steve Moriarty, all of whom were students there. Now, bassist Matt Dresner would recall the first time he heard Mia sing a few months before the Gits formed. It was the spring of 1986 during an open mic event at the college campus, and he would tell Rolling Stone, "A bunch of students took turns getting up on stage and played their songs. To me, everything sounded like Joan Baez or Fish. Then there was Mia. I don't remember what song she opened with, maybe Bessie Smith, maybe something she wrote. Whatever it was, I was transfixed and overcome. I cried. It was raw, honest, to the bone, and straight from the heart. No music or musician had ever affected me like she did that night." And following that performance, the Gits would form, and they would make an immediate impact on fellow student Valerie Agnew, who would co-found the Seattle punk band 7 Year Bitch. And by 1989, the Gits headed for a new home, moving across the country to Seattle and setting up shop in a dilapidated house called the Rat House. Now, the Gits didn't immediately feel like Seattle was their home, with Moriarty remembering, "We didn't fit in when we got there, so we had to form our own scene, play our own shows. I think we would have liked to have the attention of a record label and be one of the cool kids on the block, but we weren't. We had to forge our own path," he'd remember. Now, the Gits soon enough were playing extensive tours up and down the West Coast and were sharing the bills with the likes of future 90s rock stars including Nirvana, Sublime, Green Day, and Beck. But by 1991, the Gits would release their debut record, Frenching the Bully, on an independent record label named CZ. Now, while the release did little to raise the band's profile, it was the constant live touring that made the band hone their craft. A few years later, by 1993, the Gits were extremely busy. They were working on their second record when they were made an offer by major label Atlantic Records to sign with them. Now, the band was also about to tour with L7 and 7 Year Bitch across Europe and America. Now, the American tour dates were going to see the bands follow the Pope during his visit to America as a type of protest. And Kessler would remember, the band was getting better and better. The live shows seemed to be getting more and more intense. It was continually moving upwards. Then everything came crashing down on July 6, 1993. Zapata was out with her friends at the Comet Tavern in Seattle's Capitol Hill area. And it was during this time the band was taking meetings with Atlantic Records in Los Angeles, and Zapata had performed some solo shows there as well. Now, according to one of Zapata's friends, the singer seemed to be in a good mood and would leave the bar around midnight. She was leaving the bar to go look for her boyfriend Robert Jenkins, who she thought was at a rehearsal space in an apartment a block or so from the bar. Unable to find Jenkins, Zapata was reported to have went to a friend's place in the same apartment building until about 2 in the morning. That was the last time she was reported to be alive. What happened afterwards for the next 80 minutes was not immediately clear. What we do know is that around 3:20 a.m., a pedestrian walking in the central area, which was a few miles from the Comet Bar, would find Zapata's body lying on an empty street. Her body was found about a block from a local fire station, and the pedestrian would notify the firemen of the body. Medics would arrive on the scene, but they'd be unable to revive her, and she was pronounced dead. It would later come out that she had been raped and strangled to death with the laces of her Gits hoodie she was wearing at the time. Now, as I said before, the band was in the middle of recording their second record when Zapata failed to show up in the studio the next morning. Unable to locate her, one of her friends would call the morgue, and sure enough, she was there. It would turn out that the medical examiner knew it was Mia upon seeing her body because he happened to be a fan of the Seattle music scene and had actually seen the Gits play. Now, following her death, everyone in her circle started to suspect each other of being the murderer. Now, the Gits Steve Moriarty would talk about the impact the crime had on the small music community in the city, saying people were buying guns and weapons and carrying them around. They wanted to find and kill the guy. People were raging. Now, the murder also had the impact of shattering a certain level of innocence and a carefree attitude that people thought existed in the community. The Gits bassist Matt Dresner would recall to Rolling Stone, "Mia's murder put an unbreakable pall on our tight-knit community. There was definitely a sense of fear and suspicion, based largely on the fact that the police had no leads to find the murderer. I felt like everyone was coming up with theories and conspiracies about who killed Mia, with a lot of our close friends becoming suspects of the Seattle Police Department and or the community. It sucked," he'd say. Now, if there was anything positive to come out of the whole experience, it was that Home Alive was founded. It would be a non-profit that was founded by Valerie Agnew, the drummer from 7 Year Bitch, that would raise awareness about violence against women. And one of the non-profit's goals was to teach women street fighting skills, weapons training, and how to deal and de-escalate conflicts. Now, rock stars and other bands would offer their support to the organization as well, as Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam would help get the organization set up with Epic Records, who agreed to release a benefit album that raised over $200,000 for the group and got them a ton of press. Also helping were fellow Seattle artists including Nirvana and Soundgarden, who were some of the bands who contributed to the release. And several benefit shows would be held, including one where Nirvana played, and it would be one of the band's last shows. It was a fitting tribute since the Gits played one of their first shows when they arrived in Seattle with Nirvana. Now, while the benefit shows for Home Alive was getting a lot of support, the surviving members of the Gits were growing frustrated with the police investigation and decided to take things into their own hands. They would play a bunch of benefit shows to raise funds to hire a private investigator, and the Gits drummer Steve Moriarty would suggest that perhaps the police were judgmental towards Mia because she was a rocker, she had jean shorts, had dreads, and was out drinking the night she was found. Now, when it came to the crime scene, there wasn't a lot of information to go off of. There were no fingerprints, witnesses, or even much DNA to go off of, and the investigators were stumped. Now, despite that, the investigators had taken swabs off Zapata's body and preserved them. Now, there were some samples of saliva found on her body, but they were too small to analyze for DNA, so the samples were left in storage. Now, despite all the national attention the case received and the outpouring of support the community would give the Gits, the case went unsolved for almost a decade. It wasn't until December of 2002 that a breakthrough finally happened. So in December of 2002, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab ran a DNA analysis on some of the preserved swabs of saliva that had been taken off Zapata at the crime scene. They were surprisingly able to find a match. A man named Jesus Mezquia, who was living as a fisherman all the way across the country in Florida, was a match with one of the swabs. He had immigrated to the US in the 80s and had a pretty extensive rap sheet including robbery, burglary, kidnapping, and battery, and following his arrest for the possession of burglary tools several years prior, he would have his DNA entered into a national databank. Now, in 1993, Mezquia was also living in Seattle. In fact, he had lived several blocks from where Zapata's body was found. And following the DNA match, the Seattle investigators, some of whom worked the original case, would fly to Miami, Florida, and surveilled Mezquia. He would eventually be arrested by Floridian authorities and interrogated about his role in the murder. Now, Mezquia originally denied knowing Zapata, but confessed to living in Seattle at the time. At the end of the day, Mezquia would be extradited back to Seattle to face trial, and the jury would deliberate for about 3 days and find him guilty, and he would be sentenced to 37 years in prison. Now, the Gits' second album, Enter the Conquering Chicken, would be released a year after Zapata's death in 1994, and it would be followed by a series of archival releases over the years. Now, Enter the Conquering Chicken would feature the eerie track Sign of the Crab, which was written by Zapata, imagining her murder at the hands of a stranger. Now, in 2015, the surviving members of the band would reunite to play a benefit show with Rachel Flotard of Viz Queen handling vocal duties. And Moriarty still deals with the pain, telling Rolling Stone in 2018, "It's always there." But he would also launch a Kickstarter campaign the same year to write a book on his former singer, saying, "It'll have a major impact on my life forever. I have more faith in life, but I'm always weary and I understand darkness and human nature," he'd say. So that does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like button and subscribe, And as always, if you have suggestions for future topics, let me know in the comment section below. Take care.